Early in 1861, when South Carolina no longer considered itself part of the Union and demanded that the U.S. Army abandon Fort Sumter, plans for a Confederate postal system were already underway. Indeed, the Confederate Post Office was established on February 21, 1861, and it was not until April 12 that the American Civil War officially began, when the Confederate Army fired upon U.S. soldiers who had refused to abandon the fort. However, the United States Post Office Department continued to handle the mail of the seceded states as usual during the first weeks of the war. It was not until June 1 that the Confederate Post Office took over collection and delivery. Now faced with the task of providing postage stamps and mail services for its citizens, the CSA Constitution had provided for a national postal service to be established, then required it to be self-financing beginning March 1, 1863. The Confederate Post Office proved to be very efficient and remained in operation for the entire duration of the Civil War. Beginnings. During the first 7 weeks of the Civil War, the U.S. Post Office still delivered mail from the seceded states. Mail that was postmarked after the date of a state's admission into the Confederacy through May 31, 1861, and bearing U.S. postage is deemed to represent Confederate state usage of U.S. stamps, i.e., Confederate covers franked with Union stamps. After this time, private express companies still managed to carry the mail across enemy lines. The three major express companies in operation throughout the South were Adams Express, American Letter Express, and Whitesides Express. They had been operating freely for approximately 2 months when the U.S. Post Office ordered an end to such traffic, effective August 26, 1861. Mail destined to states that were not among their own unions now had to be sent by flag of truce. Although some express companies still continued to run their mail operations illegally, Adams continued its southern operations under a nominally separate Southern Express Company, in actuality a subsidiary. Mail was also smuggled in and out by blockade-running ships, which, however, were often captured or destroyed by Union ships on blockade patrol. Because Confederate post offices existed for only a few years and official and informal records of them are lacking, relatively little is known about their operations in many regions of the South. Existing data has been studied by several experts in the field, who have reconstructed an account of their existence and operation largely from surviving Confederate covers, and by researchers specializing in advanced studies of Confederate philately, notably Colonel Harvey Shepard, United States Army, Fort Hood, Texas, the late Van Dyke McBride, Newark, New Jersey, George N. Malpass, St. Petersburg, Florida, Erlantrum, Nampa, Idaho, David Cone, Washington, C., and a few others, each contributing material in the concerted effort to create an overall account of Confederate postal history. Confederate Post Office. One of the first undertakings in establishing the Confederate Post Office was the appointment of John H. Reagan to Postmaster General, by Jefferson Davis in 1861, making him the first Postmaster General of the newly formed Confederate Post Office. Reagan was a Democratic congressman from Texas. Upon appointment, Reagan became a close friend of Davis and was Postmaster General for the duration of the war, making him the only PMG of the short-lived Confederacy. In preparation for wartime mail delivery, Reagan proved to be very resourceful. He sent an agent to Washington with letters asking the various heads of the U.S. Post Office Department to come work for the new Confederate Post Office. Amazingly, nearly all of them did, bringing copies of records and account books along with them. Reagan in effect had stolen the U.S. Post Office. Notable historian William C. Davis wrote, Reagan was obviously an able administrator, presiding over the only CSA cabinet department that functioned well during the war. It established new rates rather higher than those in the Union. 5 per half ounce under 500 miles, 10 per half ounce over 500 miles, 2 for drop letters and circulars. Later the under 500 miles rate was raised to 10 also. There was a 50 rate for express mail, and after 1863 a 40 rate for trans-Mississippi mail to cover the costs of smuggling the mail through a federal blockade that operated along the entire length of the lower Mississippi River. At the beginning of the war, Union blockades prevented supplies from reaching their destinations in the South, which from time to time resulted in the shortage of postage stamps, paper and other basic supplies that were much needed throughout the Confederate States. Although the Confederate government had contracted for the printing of its own stamps, they were not yet available on June 1, forcing postmasters all over the South to improvise. Most of the time they simply went back to the old practice of accepting payment in cash and applying a paid hand stamp to the envelope. However, a number of postmasters, particularly those in the larger cities, could not afford to be handling long lines of cash customers, and developed a variety of postmasters' provisionals. These took a variety of forms, from envelopes pre-stamped with a postmark modified to say, paid, or an amount, to regular stamps produced by local printers. Some are today among the great rarities of philately. Confederate postage. Within a month after his appointment as Postmaster General, Reagan ordered that ads be placed in both Southern and Northern newspapers seeking sealed proposals from printing companies for producing Confederate postage stamps. Bids arrived from companies in New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Newark, New Orleans and Richmond. After the war started, however, it became evident that the contract to print Confederate stamps should go to a Confederate firm. The Confederate Post Office Department therefore awarded the contract to lithographers Hoyer and Ludwig, a small firm in Richmond. The stamps they produced were inferior in image quality to the line-engraved stamps printed by the U.S. Post Office, but with what resources they had, they produced some handsome images by many accounts. The first Confederate postage issues were placed in circulation in October 1861, 5 months after postal service between the North and South had ended. Jefferson Davis is depicted on the first issue of 1861. The appearance of a living person on a postage stamp marked a break from the tradition adhered to by the U.S. Post Office, that a person may be depicted on U.S. postage or currency only after death. Provisional stamps. During the 5 months between the U.S. Post Office's withdrawal of services from the seceded states and the first issue of Confederate postage stamps, postmasters throughout the Confederacy used temporary substitutes for postal payment. Postmasters had to improvise and used various methods to apply confirmation of postage to mailed covers, ranging from the creation of their own adhesive postage stamps to the marking of letters with either rate-altered hand stamps or the manuscript indication, paid. The improvised stamps and prepaid covers are known to collectors as postmaster provisionals, so called because they were used provisionally until the first Confederate general postage stamp issues appeared. Some Confederate post offices would subsequently experience shortages in postage stamps and would revert to the use of provisional stamps and hand stamps. There are many dozens of types of provisional stamps and hand stamps from different towns and cities about the Confederacy. In some circles, postmaster provisionals are referred to as local since they were intended only for use from the town in which they were issued. Postage stamps. As the Confederate States of America existed for only 4 years, it was able to issue only a modest number of postage stamps, 9 basic types in all. During this brief span, the Confederate Post Office contracted with 5 different printing companies to produce postage stamps: Archer and Daly of Richmond, Virginia; Hoyer and Ludwig of Richmond, Virginia; J. T. Patterson & Co. of Augusta, Georgia, Thomas de la Rue & Co., Limited, of London, England, and Keating & Ball of Columbia, South Carolina. Among them, these firms employed all three methods of printing commonly in use at that time: lithography, typography, and line engraving. The first Confederate postage stamps were issued and placed in circulation on October 16, 1861. 5 months after postal service between the North and South had been suspended. The first postage stamp issued by the Confederate States was a 5 green depicting Jefferson Davis. It was printed by the lithograph process by Hoyer and Ludwig of Richmond, Virginia. Like almost all Confederate issues, these stamps were imperforate, and single stamps had to be cut from the sheet with razors or scissors. This stamp was reprinted in blue in 1862. A 10 blue with Thomas Jefferson also appeared in 1861, designed by Charles Ludwig of Hoyer and Ludwig, Richmond, Virginia. This issue was printed by 2 different companies, Hoyer and Ludwig, and later, T. Patterson & Co. of Augusta, Georgia. The image of Thomas Jefferson used on both printings lithographically reproduced the same image that had been engraved on the U.S. 5-cent issue of 1856. Secret marks were added by the Patterson firm to the transfer stones to distinguish its version from the Hoyer and Ludwig prints of the same design. The most typical use was for the 10-cent rate after July 1, 1862. This stamp, like the 5 Davis, was reprinted in 1862, in a rose-colored version that is considerably rarer than the blue original. In 1862, a 2 stamp of Andrew Jackson appeared, in green, and was issued imperforate. This issue was again lithographed by Hoyer and Ludwig of Richmond, Virginia. Only one transfer stone used in this printing. The earliest known usage of this stamp was March 21, 1862. Sheets of this issue consisted of 2 panes of 100 stamps each arranged in 2 blocks of 50 taken from the 50 subject transfer stone with a wide, vertical gutter between panes. This was the last lithographed stamp produced by the Confederate Post Office. Also in 1862, a new 5 stamp of Davis, this time utilizing typography, was issued in large quantities. Produced by the de la Rue firm in London, it employed an engraving of Davis by Ferdinand Joubert. De la Rue shipped 12 million copies of this issue to the Confederacy, accompanied by a set of printing plates and a supply of English paper so that additional copies could be produced locally. More than 36 million of the 5 Davis stamps were subsequently printed from the de la Rue plates by Archer and Daly in Richmond. Archer and Daly eventually ran out of the English paper, and their later printings on Confederate paper tended to become increasingly coarse, with individual examples exhibiting blank areas in the design from plate damage or filled in areas due to plate wear. De la Rue also printed and shipped a typographed 1 orange stamp depicting John C. Calhoun. The Confederate Post Office had planned to reduce the drop letter rate to 1 cent, but this proved impractical and, as a result, the 1 stamp was never put into use. Joubert de la Ferté again engraved the central image of Calhoun, placing it in the same framework design used for the Jefferson Davis 5-cent issue. A clear attempt to show that the 2 stamps were part of the same series. In 1863, a new 2 Jackson design appeared, engraved in steel by Frederick Halpin and printed by Archer and Daly in pale red. A second printing appeared in brown red. Line engraving would be employed in all subsequent Confederate stamps. Also in 1863, a 10-cent stamp was released bearing the profile of Jefferson Davis in blue. This issue was designed and engraved on steel by John Archer and transferred to either copper plates or steel plates. Many shades exist for these stamps, ranging from light milky blue and darker blue to shades that tend toward greenish blue and green. There are 4 similar designs of engraved 10-cent stamps. The easiest to distinguish from the other 3 has the value expressed as 10. The portrait of Jefferson Davis was designed and line engraved by John Archer, and then transferred to a copper plate. This issue was imperforate and was printed on soft, porous paper of varying thickness and with colorless gum. The earliest recorded usage is April 23, 1863. Color variations occur from dark blue to gray blue. The next easiest to distinguish has straight lines enclosing the design in a rectangle. Several distinct shades of blue occur in this printing. The earliest recorded usage is April 23, 1863. All of these were printed by Archer and Daly of Richmond. This frameline variety is by far the rarest of the stamps issued by the Confederate Post Office. Even poor copies shorn of most of the framing can command prices upwards of $1,000. Type 1, initially printed by Archer and Daly, banknote engravers, Richmond, Virginia, employs the same engraving as the frameline issue but without the framelines. There were approximately 23,800,000 stamps printed from 2 plates, each with 2 panes of 100. The earliest recorded usage is April 21, 1863. Type 2, also at first printed by Archer and Daly, is very similar to Type 1. Frederick Halpin designed and engraved the image of Davis. The corner ornaments are filled, and a faint line follows the outside of the design and encloses it. The Archer and Daly plates for both Type 1 and Type 2 were moved from Richmond to Columbia, South Carolina, when the fall of Richmond became imminent in late 1864. The company of Keating and Ball then printed the 2 stamps. A small number of Types I and II in Archer and Daly printings were perforated and released for use by the Confederate Post Office Department in 1864. The perforations on these were often of notably poor quality, and forgeries abound, many of which betray themselves by perforations that either employ the wrong gauge or are cut too crisply. A 20 stamp with George Washington also appeared in 1863, again employing a design engraved in steel by Halpin and printed by Archer and Daly. This issue saw only limited use, with the result that genuine used copies are today worth 10 times more than mint examples.